I was homeschooled my whole life. And all the people around me were homeschooled also. All our friends are homeschooled. Most of them all went to the same church. And everybody that I grew up with, their mothers did not work. That was not a thing, and, working was bad. Putting your child in daycare was bad. That was letting someone else raise your child, and why did you have a child? And one time my brother was in daycare for the gym and he hurt his head. So therefore, your kid's going to get injured if they go to daycare and it's going to be terrible, right? So that was how I grew up. Being taught that, one of my friends' mom one time got a small part-time job near Christmas time when they were all teenagers to earn some extra money. But that was it. Nobody's mom worked. And I distinctly remember even when my parents split up, some of our old friends coming by to tell my dad that this was probably because he'd let my mom do anything outside of the house at all, and otherwise they wouldn't have got divorced and everything would have been great, right? So that was, I think in some ways, not what my parents thought they told me, but that was what they exposed me to and therefore told me. They also made it really clear that we were all to go to college, which was definitely kind of a confusing message. Certainly wasn't the only one. So, and regardless, as you might infer, my childhood wasn't great, so I needed to go to college and get a job and get out of there. So I went to college, worked hard, got married in my last year of college. When I graduated, I was 7 months pregnant. Graduated another girl who was 1 day from her due date, so I was doing a little better than she was. We both made it, though. And then 2 months later, I had my baby. And I had this dear, sweet little baby, and she was so precious, and we were so close. And I spent all the time with her. And the first time I was away from her was when I went and took my NCLEX, which is the final exam you take for nurses to get your license, if you don't know. It's a big deal. It can be up to 3 hours long. You can have up to over 200 questions on it. And she's about 4 months old, I think, when I took that, so it was maybe September at that point. And it was probably in a way good for me in terms of taking the tests, because I was so much more worried about leaving her alone for up to 3 hours, which is the longest she'd been away from me at that point in her life, and that I'd been away from her in her entire life. So I wasn't as worried about passing the test, and I did pass the test. I did really well. I actually passed 75 questions. I remember it got to what I thought was, because the counting was a little weird, and it didn't. I was like, okay, that's okay. That doesn't mean I did bad. I'll still pass. And then it turned off at the next question. I was like, oh, okay, thank God, I got to get out and go see my baby. And I remember my mom was watching her, and she said, it's okay. I took her to Kmart, and I showed her shiny things, and she was fine. And I was like, okay, she was fine. Of course she was fine. It's just 3 hours, right? But when your baby's 4 months old and has never been away from you, it seems like an eternity. But, passing the test is the first part. Then you got to do something. I mean, you went and you got this degree, and also you have these loans that you're going to have to start paying on. And, you didn't do all this for nothing. But I had this little baby. And I applied for this job, and I got this job. It was at least part-time, so I was working 24 hours a week, 12 hours away from my little baby. But I still hadn't been away from him for 12 hours. And she was 8 or 9 months old at that point. And she was so sweet. And she was so lovey. And she'd give you little kisses. And I felt so much guilt. How could I do this? This is not how I was raised. You don't leave your baby with other people, right, to take care of her. And what made it worse, to jump forward a little bit, is the first babysitting situation we found for her was not good at all. And I had some bad feelings about it, but when you're a new parent, kind of everything feels bad. You're like, oh my God, my child's going to choke to death and die. She's going to stop breathing and die. Everything's bad. So you're like, well, maybe this is just the way it is, because I already know daycare is bad, so maybe it's meant to feel bad. And when that daycare provider called us one Sunday night and was like, oh, I'm sick, I can't have her Monday morning, which is didn't you know this all weekend? I usually feel sick coming on. It's okay, you know what? Good. This is not good. Every time I pick her up, she would scream, in a way that suggested that it wasn't worth crying earlier. But now that she saw me, please rescue me. And we went and found someone else that night. And this lady was lovely, and she loved Ari. And when Ari would come, she'd be like, "It's a special day because Ari's here." I don't know how that made the other kids feel. I didn't realize afterwards, since she was part-time, she didn't come every day, but that's still, but like, if your kid's gonna be at daycare, like them being the daycare provider's favorite, like, that's a pretty good thing, right? So even with that, it was still hard. But what really was the moment that helped me realize that this was okay is one day I got home. She was already home. And I came in the door, and she looks at me, and she goes, "Mommy!" And I realized at that moment that if I never leave her, she doesn't get to experience that joy of coming back. She doesn't get to realize that I will come back, and that her time with me is worthwhile, all the more because it's not every day. It's not all the time. And that was the start for me of realizing that there were a whole lot of things about this that were good for her that she would never get if I was home with her all of the time.